start the questions answering session, 5 minutes. So if we're waiting for the presenters to connect after the break, and we'll answer the question that appeared. And the question is how to deal with the representations in case in which we have to redigitize one page of the 100-page book. Does this event results in the creation of second representation consisting of 99 old files and the one new file? What about the files that are not meant to represent the intellectual entity as a whole? For example, the thermographic photography of one page of the manuscript in order to capture watermark. Can this individual file be an alternative representation on its own? And the question is copied to question and answers module in Teams, in Microsoft Teams, so that you can see it all. I can see Eld and Karin already online, so if any one of you would like to answer, I can see also Michelle. So we'll go into presentation continuation.
Yes, I can try and answer this. It's a very long question, so I hope I get it right. That is a problem whether it's a new representation or whether it's a totally new object when you redigitize a page. And that's actually up to the organization how you want to interpret it. I think because normally you would say it is what we want to interpret as this page. So if I was a curator, I would make a policy saying this is a new representation. So it actually fits in, but you can model it in different ways. And the decision on whether it should be a new representation for an existing digital intellectual entity or whether it should be something new, that's up to you.
I can maybe add something from an implementation example side. So in our implementation, it works in a way where you can version IEs and you also version representation. So if you version something on the representation or on the file level, it will automatically create a new version of an IE. And we operate with logical IEs, so not physical ones. So in your example of the 100 books, there's a manifest that describes all the files of the 100 files that are digitized. And if one is replaced for that, we create a second file version of it. And the second version of the IE links to the 99 old files and the one new file. But we also store the old version that still links to the 99 old files and the one file that was replaced. So we have a full audit trail within the repository that includes all versions in the history. So it's not per se a new representation, but a new version of the representation because it's a file that was replaced. That's the logical thinking behind it, but like Eld said, it's really up to the institution to decide. But I think it's helpful to really look at what others are doing and I think it's an often asked question if you actually have to double store all the files just because you're replacing one, and in most implementations you don't have to.
I hope that answers the question. So who will be next presenter?
There's another question actually. So there was a question. I hope it's okay to ask, but I would like to know what were the biggest challenge or challenges that you have encountered in using PREMIS in your digital preservation efforts? Or in other words, what are your tips for successful implementation of PREMIS?
I actually think that's something we are getting into now because the the thing is that you need to make a lot of decisions before you use premise. And that's, for instance, how do you put your premise? Do you want to use XML or RDF, or how do you want to do it? Do you want to combine it with METs? And where should it be placed in the MET structure if you're using METs? And then, of course, the granularity that you want to have the different things in. You could say that you can start by looking at premise and what kind of preservation metadata do you, as your organization, want to include as your preservation metadata. As we have said many times, you don't need to include it all, but it's a good checklist for people that has worked with preservation metadata in many years for what can be worthwhile to actually preserve in your preservation metadata. So I think it is to actually make a good layout and make decisions before you start and make a plan for it.
Thank you very much. Any more comments?
I think to add to that, what also helps us is to have use cases, because for a lot of these things, you will need input from different parts of your organization. It's not always just the digital preservation team or whoever's writing this, but you will need input from acquisition teams, from management about the policy decisions. So it's really good to sit down and think, what are you achieving with this, and show people what the benefit is. So a lot of it, I think, is also an organizational hindrance, and not necessarily a technical one, or one of how to actually write it down. So try to get everybody on board and show them what everybody can get out of it.
Thank you.
And I think actually there the stage for me was set to continue talking about those parts. So I'm stealing the screen.
Okay, you're welcome.
So actually, how to use premise. Seeing the data dictionary in action. You have heard now Elle been talking about the semantic units, the entities, and I know it's a lot of things to take in and grasp at once, but then we come to the part, yes, we need to implement it, and sort of Elle has already made the summary of what I'm going to talk about, so I'm going to talk a little more about it. So when you're using premise, you can actually use it to create local standards. So you use premise at the starting point for defining your preservation. So we have in Netherlands the Institute for Sound and Vision. They store TV, movies, and so on in the Netherlands. And they have actually started off with the premise data dictionary and extended it to be their metadata dictionary for their preservation. Also, if you look into the PIP, or however they are pronouncing that acronym, so the ISO standard for the data exchange protocol for interoperability and preservation, you can see that they have been inspired by premise, but they don't take the leap and just use premise. They have writing something on their own, but you can totally see that it's inspiration. It has already been said a number of times, you can use it as a self-assessment tool. You remember what Micky showed earlier on today. I have this object. What do I need to know about it to be able to preserve it? So showing the mapping between what I have and what you can find the semantic units premise have, and looking into the conformance statement, that actually is conformance level 1 through mapping. So you can actually name your things whatever you want, quite frankly, as long as you can map it to premise. So if you label size bigness or something just to make it rather silly, that's okay. you have defined it as being the size of the digital object. If you then name it storlek, as I would do in Swedish, or if you name it size, it's the same thing. So those two are easy to map. Then we have some different other Swedish words that I'm not going to into, where we can't really do it that easy, but really through mapping is the lowest level of conformance. We have already also talked about this. You can express premise with the help of XML and RDF. And there I'm going out on the slippery hill and everything, because I'm not an expert in our RDF. Like Eld, I'm mostly seeing the XML. But I'm going to show you a little bit, and then you will have to deep dive on your own, or we are also looking into, you do have a lot of resources on our web page. But conformance level number 2 is that you can actually export what you have in your system. So I'm exporting in premise format to send it to Eld, who doesn't want my preservation level, but I totally understand that, because she can't understand my level at all, and she takes it over. So I'm doing an export. When we come to that, we also come into, so it's technical term is serializing premise. So in XML, you follow it's following strict the data dictionary. You have one semantic unit, is one XML element. Al has already shown you the trick of how you describe the object type in the XML. There's one XML schema that's ready, it's available, it's online. And then you have RDF. There are some liberties that has been taken regarding the structure and the semantic units, and actually also reuse of things that already exist that has the same meaning. So there are an OWL ontology available on the web page named id.loc.gov, where the Library of Congress have a number of different ontologies published, and where also these value lists that we are referring to are also placed. And as I said, there are documentation and guidelines. But at the same time, if you want to use YAML or JSON or whatever, that is actually also okay, as long as you understand and you can map it back to premise. So here is where I'm starting to go onto that slippery hill covered with ice. It's snowing here in Sweden currently again. When you adapt it to the RDF expression, you see that the prefix are not premise. And that is because other vocabularies and ontologies has been used, because they already have those elements. You also see between the agent and the object that we are having more relational subtype is file and bitstream. And for the intellectual entity, it's already defined in SCOS. So that's been reused. So and here is where I'm more confident in what I'm saying, is that we do have a file. It has a name. It's an ARC descriptor. Nobody has done something with it. It's not encrypted, it's not compressed, it's not packed. It's just a file. What we do have is that we have a checksum of the type MD5. It has been calculated by a tool called NRE. Quite frankly, I don't know what tool that is. And there we come back to the question earlier today. Is there a ready vocabulary for these softwares? No, it's not. And we do have the checksum itself. We do have a size, and when you look in premise, the size is always in bytes. So that's what we say. So you have to give all those 7 numbers in this case. And for some reason, someone still wants to preserve a WordPerfect 5.1 file. So we need the environments that Elle talked about, but we're not going there, not yet. If we look at it in XML, it's quite simple, easy. We have the file, we have the object characteristics under it, we have the identifier, and as Elle said, type and value is always mandatory. How can we otherwise identify this object? When we look at the object characteristics, the composition level, Elle was talking about that this PAC file, that we had different composition levels. We have done nothing with this file, so it's not in the composition, it's just the file itself, and it has a size. Then we have the fixity, where we need to know the algorithm to be able to redo the calculations. We can check that it's actually the same file. And we have the format, and we actually have checked the format. We know it's WordPerfect for DOS and the format version. Simple, clean. And then we dive into the XML. That looks like this. So it's still the same things, but now in the XML format. This file I can easily send to Elle, and she can take over the maintenance of this object for me. Then we come into the RDF, and here is where we are really looking into using different things. We have the file, it has its identifier. We have the format. We have actually checked that format through the help of pronoun. So we actually get an identifier for the format, which also gives us a label and the version. We have the composition level, and we have the size, and we have the fixity using another ontology where we have a crypt hash func. I love all these acronyms. And we have the type being MD5. We have here it becomes not the software, here we say the creator of the checksum and the value. This is kind of more easy to see when we do it in our PREMIS RDF. So still, it's the same thing, and it all depends on who is the receiver of this information. Am I sending it to Elle? I think she wants XML. Other people want to have the RDF, but I can also store it in RDF or XML if I want to. But that's the brilliance of using PREMIS. You set up and you have to do the thinking that we just talked about. How do I use PREMIS? And I think that's the biggest question. What is my purpose? Why am I doing this? Then we have the next part of using PREMIS, as I just was into. It can be the native format for the repository. So I can use XML, I can use RDF triples. I actually can build a relational database, but as Elle said, the data model is not a ready database model. You really need to figure that out and see how it should look in your database. And here we end up on the conformance level 3 through internal implementation. We have actually taken the whole PREMIS data dictionary and everything and put it into our system. Then we have to take this once more and look at. So as we already said, I think all three of us have said, you have to choose which entities you are implementing. The object is seen as the core entity. That's the thing you always need to know something about. So that's level A, and that is same for all the different conformance levels. So you have A where you just implement the object, and then you implement object and then an agent. Then you have the level B. The rights entity is not part of the conformance statement because that's really, since it's more about tracking what you are allowed to do in your storage with the entity, that's always depending on the object, the one who gave it to you, the institutional policies and everything. So just in conformance, looking at the conformance, it's the object, the event, and agents that you need to really see how you want to implement. Of course, we have a web page with the conformance statement. It's not a 2-pager, it's I think it's 3 or 4 pages, but read through it because that's aiding in the discussion you need to have when you look at implementing PREMIS. Any questions so far?
I cannot see any questions both in shared file and on Teams module.
That's good. I'm actually going to skip this one. I thought we needed something in Sweden after just about 20 minutes after lunch, you get into what we call paltkoma, which means that you have eaten and you are starting feeling that. I'm going to continue instead, so we move that break a little bit. So we have the conformance. Moving over to implementation case studies, and Elle has already mentioned METs. And we have already also heard that Micky will actually show and describe how you can implement PREMIS in XML. But remember, it's not mandatory to use XML. We do it because we are most familiar with that. PREMIS is in many cases used together with METs. METs is the acronym for the Metadata Encoding and Transmission Standard, and it's totally about being a hub document for digital material. You can use it to describe the SIP, AIP, and DIP in the OASIS reference model if you want to. And the thing is that when you start using more than one standard, you will have redundancies. So here is also a time when you decide to use both METs and PREMIS to decide, do I allow all these redundancies? In some cases, you can't make another decision because it's something that is mandatory in both the standards. But you need to look into and see how you actually handle that. If you're not too familiar with METs, METs is based upon having 7 sections. You have the METs header that describes the METs package, so the information package itself. Who is the sender, who is the receiver, when was it created, and those kind of stuff. Then you have the descriptive metadata section, and there is where you actually can link to something like a MARC record, an EID record, depending on what standards you are using. The big, for us today, interesting part is the administrative metadata section. So I'm coming back to that one in just in the next slide. Then you have the file section. There is where you describe all the files that are being transferred. The other files that we have in the sections above are metadata about the files, but then we need to have the files themselves. Then we have the structural map section, which is the only required element in the whole standard METs. There is where you describe how the structure is, and it can be a totally imaginary structure. It can be a physical structure. It's up to you. The most common example I have seen is describing that book we have been talking and scanning. It had 99 plus 1 pages. I guess it has a front page and everything, so you can describe that rather easily in the struct map. We also already been talking about web pages. So if you are using METs for describing a web page, you can actually create the links between the different web pages that you are describing in the struct map with the help of the struct link. And then we have behavior section, which is, if you go back to that WordPerfect file, remember the good old days when we wrote everything on the keyboard in the command prompt for opening in a file? AutoCAD is a good example. You wrote a long string telling, I want to see this in these layers so I can see my electrical engineering part directly. That is what you can use the behavior section for. Not very often used, but the latest use case was actually someone has digitized scrolls, and scrolls that are not possible to actually roll up. They have actually scanned them in layers, and they are using the behavior section to actually connect all these layers so you actually can roll out the scroll and actually read it. I haven't seen the result, but I have seen parts of it, and it's really amazing what you can do. So when you look into the administrative metadata section, in METS, there are 4 different types of administrative metadata. You have the technical metadata, so purely what Eld described earlier with mix. We have sources, we have the rights, and we have the digital provenance metadata. So that's the 4 flavors you can actually make a good mixture of. And then, as I said, using PREMIS with METS, the 2 boards are actually sharing some members and also working really together. So the METS board and the PREMIS editorial committee has actually written a guideline on how to use these 2 together. And you can do this in different ways. I think you have gotten the hint of what Eld has been talking about, that we can actually, you can store the agent as it is, the object as it is, and the rights and the events as they're separate things, or you can put them all together in one big pile. And all these different ways is possible to replica into the METS document. So if you want to split everything up, the recommendation is that you put the different objects in the technical metadata section, the intellectual entity in the descriptive metadata section. So on the upper level, when the intellectual entity is of the type environment. The events are the digital provenance, what has actually happened with my object. Rights, yeah, rights metadata section, kind of a match not needed to be described. Agent and events, digital provenance, and agents and rights in the rights metadata section. So there you really need to look into what agents you are having and how you want to connect them. So there are some space for doing what you need to do. Or you can make it easy. You have all your premise in one chunk and put it into the digital provenance metadata, which is, so far as I've seen, it's actually the most common way of doing it. So you have all the premise metadata in the METS document in just one place. Are you ready, Micky, to go over to really show that XML we've been talking about for a long time?
Yes, we can do that. Let me my PowerPoint. So here it finally is the example that has been alluded to so many times. So PREMIS in XML. Let's think of a very, very simple use case. I think one that we all know from digital preservation practice. So imagine the following. You're a digital preservationist, probably not very hard to imagine for a lot of people in the audience, and you want to run file format identification on a file. So you need to ask yourself, what relevant information do you need to capture? You probably need to know when this process was done, and of course, what was done on which object, what was the result, and with what tool did you run it, and whether you used any special configurations. So now I'd like to briefly show you one example of what this could look like in PREMIS. So for the event info, the question what was done and when was it done? Here we see a little excerpt that describes the event entity. And what do we see? We see here, regarding the question what was done, that it is an event of the type format identification. So this helps us to group together different events that belong to a specific type, because of course format identification can be run by different tools and at different times, but they're all of the type file format or format identification. We also see when it was run, and the date captured in a standardized form, because as we said in the beginning, PREMIS really tries to support your automated processes to make best use of your data in any kind of automatic process that you want to leverage on it. So here we have the date timestamp. And then the event also has an identifier. We've seen this for all the data dictionary explanations that Elt went through, that for every entity, there's very clear identifiers that help us to link different information parts together to have them point at each other. So in this case, if I want to refer to the event from any other kind of my, any other location in my metadata, I can point to it using, or reference it using this identifier type and value. So the next question that we had was, what was the result? What was the outcome of my file format identification? We're still in the event entity, and what do we see here? First, we see that it was success, so we see that it worked, which of course is great news. We're happy to hear that, but I'm sure that we'd like to know a little bit more of what happened than just the fact that it did work. So that is the outcome detail in this case. We see that the result was FMT 276. Which some may know is a pronoun PUID, a persistent identifier for a file format. And we'll see a little bit later in a slide where we have more info on that. And we also here see a linking object identifier. So earlier, the event itself had an identifier, and this now is an example where we're within the event entity, but we have a pointer towards an object. So the object has the identifier type local, which means it's an identifier that exists within your own repository. This could also be handle or DOI, URN, ARC, any kind of type there is. And here's the value of the identifier. So that's the object that we've linked this event to. It's the object. In that case, we suspect that it's a file because we ran file format identification on it that this event was run on. And then still information in the event entity is with what tool. Again, it's a linking agent identifier. So it points towards the agent that ran the process. In this case, it's Droid 64. And here, in this example, it was chosen to also include the binary signature and the container signature information within the tool descriptor. You may choose to do that, you may not. This is really up to you how you want to implement this within your repository. And the last question was whether there were, the last question about the agent was whether there were any special configurations. So that's something that's not part of the event category or the event entity, but it's something that we can describe within the agent entity. So here we have our identifier, Droid64, with a binary signature that was linked from the event. So we know we're in the correct agent. And we know of the agent that it is of the type software, like else it could also be an organization or a person, but in this case, it's a tool. And what else do we want to capture? We want to capture that there was a specific parametric setting within the tool. For those familiar with Droid, the file format identification tool, you may be aware of the fact that you can tell Droid whether it should just scan part of the file to arrive at a result of identification, or it can scan the entire file up to the end. This is important context information for how the tool was used, because depending on what your setting was, you can arrive at different results. It often happens with PDF and PDFA. If you don't scan the entire file, the file format might not be recognized as PDFA. So this is important context information that in this concrete use case example was chosen to store within the agent information alongside the fact what agent was it and with what signature. So now back to the result. we saw in the events category that the outcome was FMT 276, and I said we'll come back to the fact that that might have some clear information, and that's captured in the object, because of course the event told us something about the object, so actually a characteristic about the object, right? And the valuable information and characteristic is that we now know what the file format of the object is, which is what we need for digital preservation purposes. So here we're in the object that the event linked to. Our suspicion is of course right, it was a file. So this kind of breaks down what object category, what level we're describing here, whether it's the file, the bitstream, the representation, or the intellectual entity. And we know that the file format is PDF17. We know that the pronoun PUID, FMT 276, if we go to the pronoun website and look it up, actually resolves to PDF 1.7. So we see here there's two different sections which actually contain the same piece of information, but in a different notation. The bottom part, the format registry, is actually what the tool told us. And the top level, the format designation, this container, is in a maybe more human readable form for those of us who do not have all PUIDs memorized. It's important to note that you can use either of these. You could use just format designation, or you could have just format registry information, but you can also have both, depending on what your use case is and what you want to do with that information. So that was the famous XML example. And now it'd be time for another break. And the German equivalent to whatever Karin said about the post-lunch thing is Suppenkoma, which means soup coma. Thank you. Any questions?
Thank you very much.
So we are going to do a rather long wrap-up, but that's to be able to actually all the questions that are left and trying to. You got access to some exercises. We are going to look into them, but we also will look into a more real example. But some repetition. You have the data dictionary, but you need to remember we have only seen the semantic units today. There are more content in the data dictionary. There are a lot of things to read. If you print the whole one, it's more than 200 pages. So it's more than just the semantic units to give you the extra you need to be starting to have those discussions we have been saying that you need to have. You need to actually sit down and talk, not just with the preservation people, you need to talk with other people at your institution or wherever you are to really see what is the goal, what do we need to know, how deep do we need to go into stuff. As you see in the extensions that are possible, which ones are we using? It's really, it's fun discussions to have, because when you start talking about over the usual borders, which are in some institutions, it becomes really interesting to see. The big thing is actually to get the same language. So here is where we can actually use PREMIS as the foundation to actually get a common language about the preservation you need to do to be able to be around for forever. We have the resources. We have the web page. I have talked a little bit about the email list. The number of emails on the email list goes up and down. Sometimes it's really intense discussions, and sometimes for a long time you only get some nothing. But it's also you need as a user to give us the feedback and input and actually aid with the discussions. So it's not just the PREMIS editorial committee who are running the discussion, all the users are. And actually, so today has just been the basis for you. We have talked about, Elle has been talking about all the semantic units. Micky has shown a simple example and also talked about the benefits. And I'm doing the high level, why you should do this. So you need to look into it even more. This is not enough. You really need to have those discussions. And that's the big thing. You need to look into it. You can't go home now and not look at it. You need to look at it to keep it fresh in memory, to figure out, okay, what parts do we need to use? How are we going to use this? So this is just the start of the discussions you need to have before you start implementing. I mentioned some of the other resources. Understanding PREMIS is one document that actually has been translated to different languages. I know we have Italian, French, and German. There might be more. If you want to translate it, just let us know, and we can point you to correct document to use for the creation of the translation.
We are in process.
Good, nice. We have do let us know when you're ready so we can publish it. So it actually gets spread around, because I know Polish is speaking in more places than Poland. We have the premise and METS guidelines. We have the conformance statement, and we also have examples of implementation, because as you heard already been said, it's good to see what other people have been doing. Regarding premise and METS, you actually have, for METS, you can create a profile and register that one. In some of those profiles that are registered, you actually have premise metadata being stated as mandatory. So it's possible to find there as well and see some examples. What we currently are doing is that we are moving the data dictionary itself to a table-based format to simplify the maintenance and also to make it transformable to publication, both as PDF and as a web page, making it more accessible than the printout you have to do now, so clickable links and so on. Also, I've been talking a little bit about the ontology. Of course, they found some parts in the data dictionary that needs to be updated, and in most cases actually clarifications, making it easier to understand, which they found when they created ontology. We might have been a little fuzzy or not fuzzy writing some parts of the explanations, which means that they actually found them, and you need to clarify what you actually mean here, because no one can use this if you don't say what you really mean. So some extra text will be added. And as I also already mentioned, we are looking into the rights overhaul to really make it more suitable. We will still have the right spaces and everything, but working with it and having so many different institutions taking part in the work means that we also see where there are some extra semantics units needed, and same here. Sometimes you need to be able to rewrite the explanations to make it really usable and easy to use. Some people like books. A couple of years ago, there were a book published regarding PREMIS and implementing PREMIS, available as an ebook and as an hardcover, and it covers the different sectors. So you have archives, libraries, museums, and their use cases for PREMIS, as well as you have surrounding chapters describing how you can use PREMIS and how everything is interlinked. So that's a good thing to have in your bookshelf, actually. Now I'm going to do the tricky part of describing exercises in a one-way communication sort of way, besides the chat and so on. So I'm actually going to ask you, Derek, to put Eld and Micky as my students here, or sort of speaking, so we can have them talking at the same time. We have 3 exercises that I'm going to show you first, and I'm going to use Micky and Eld to sort of discuss through them. The solutions, you have a link to them here, but I have I have made an update to them, and I also created an XML version, so that will be published. That's why you're not getting everything at the same all directly, because if you have the solutions, how much fun is it to make an exercise?
We can talk simultaneously, but we cannot present camera view more than one at the time.
That's perfectly okay, because I would say, let's see how this goes. You've got sort of what we call a cheating sheet. And I'm actually going to show you that one. You got this one. So the first part of it is all the things that Eld has been talking about. So you have the object, you have its all semantics units. There we go. Moving on, and you see where it's applicable, if it's mandatory, if it's optional, if it's repeatable or non-repeatable. Same for event and agents, and you see event is not much or the agent. And you have the rights with all its part. The last page is these vocabularies that Eld was talking about and that we have mentioned. Remember what Eld said, these are getting updated. So this is the fixed version that was the one 2 weeks ago, I think. So you need to really look into them, but for the exercises, this is enough for you, but it also gives you show you what's actually available in these value lists. But as Elle said, there will be some updates made to it, but you have a first glimpse of it and really can find it easy. Going back to that one. So Elle started off with the object. That's what we're doing here. The object exercise has a number of pages. The first one is for finding the different object types, and the rest are actually to get a feel for and actually try to use the information you have to create and fill your semantic units. And there you can take the help from the handout to really see what's mandatory and what's really sort of how they are connected. So the text we have on that page is that we have an institution is preserving a digitized book. It's available online on this link. In their digital repository, they preserve a TIFF file for each of the new scan page of the book. They have a PDF file of the entire book, which is used in their access system. So if someone wants to borrow this book, they get a copy of the PDF file. And we also have an OCR file of the text. And the first task is to go through these different object type categories and which is which. So here, Micky, Eld, if we start discussing this one, where should we attack it to find out what's an intellectual entity, what's a file or representation or bitstream?
Well, there's something missing here because it's easy to identify the files. That's individual TIFF file, PDF, and OCR, I would say. Then there's the TIFF files. I expect that is representations because the individual TIFF files are down here. But they're missing layers of, it's only representation, or the intellectual entity. That it can be modeled different ways because there can be intellectual entities for the files, but they can also refer to the book. So there are different ways. What are your comments, Micky?
Yes, so I would also start at the file actually, because I'm a file person. But I think it would, and then it's clear for TIFF files because it ties several together to a representation. I think the interesting question I would have is whether the PDF file, if it's one, whether it could be both a file and the representation, because it is the same representation, or it represents the same thing of the intellectual entity as the many TIFF files do.
So here you can actually hear we have two people, and we already have different answers. So this is one of the examples to where you need to actually sit down and do this modeling. That the book at the top is really the book being the intellectual entity is rather easy to guess. That's the thing we are doing something with, and have made the representation. And as you say, Micky, that's also the thing I'm starting to think about, is the TIFF files equal to the PDF or not? And there I would say that's where we actually need to start looking into, if it's on the representation, what information can we give about the PDF file to preserve it?
It should also be said that the book can both be an intellectual entity, but it could also be a representation.
Right, of the intellectual work that was created, yeah. And also, I think the OCR file could also be a representation. It also comes down to what, I mean, depending on what do you want to preserve, right? I mean, if you're trying to preserve the exact way the book looked, then that's not something the OCR file can preserve, but it's something that the TIFF file can preserve and to some degree, and the PDF file maybe to some other degree, not quite as detailed in regards to bit depth, but.
And sometimes it is very cost important question, because to preserve TIFF files, it costs a lot, and to preserve OCR results, it's 10 or 100 times cheaper. I mean, the storage place.
Right, I think it comes down to what you all keep in your digital archive. I mean, you might have the case that your PDF file is on a digital library server somewhere, whereas the TIFF file, you just store the master in your preservation system. But something you can do if you model different representations, and that comes down to PREMIS being good for automatic workflows, is that you could then assign labels to them. You could assign one a master label, and then maybe one like an access copy label. And you have different policies for those. Let's say the TIFF files are really important, so you want to have multiple copies of those, but the PDF file may be not quite as important to you from a policy point of view. So you can store that somewhere else. But that's, I mean, those are just examples, and it comes down to what the use case and the concrete need in your institution is.
Perfect, thank you.
And I also think that you should, because you say TIFF files, they too do take a lot more space, but they're more standardized, they're more opened than PDFs. So from a logical preservation perspective, I would say that you want to actually preserve your TIFF files, and then you can always derive PDFs or XPDF or whatever it's named in the future, because you still can interpret your TIFF files. So again, yes, this is you may not need to have PREMIS metadata for each of these, the PDF and OCR, for instance, because that's just derived, that is in another system. I would also like to just make a point about the book saying that it can be intellectual entity and a representation. Think about whether, if you have your a book where you have your metadata, you may want to have PREMIS metadata about changes in those for the book, and then it's a representation where the intellectual book is at a higher level.
I was at the National Library in Sweden talking about this, and we even got into which book is the book.
Oh yes.
So
oh yes.
yes.
Especially there is a contradiction if IT guys talk to librarians. Oh, that is a sparky discussion.
Oh yes. So here you see, this is really what we really have given you now is a good example of you need to have these discussions. This is something you need to talk about, and we are only talking about a quotation mark simple exercise, which sparks these kind of discussions. So it's really, it might be good to just have this image and go and sit down and try to discuss what are we looking at. Together with this one in the same exercise, we do have some tables. And the thing here is to be able to connect the semantic unit with a value. So picking the values you have been given. You have some information about the book here. You have the information about the OCR file. And you have the information on the first page. So it's all about connecting and finding out the relationship, finding the object category. So you need to use both the pages. So it's really, where do the information I have, what is it? What's the semantic unit? And just to make everybody even more have the next sparky discussion, this is the answer to this exercise and how it's implemented here, where actually the book is the intellectual entity. We made it easy. We don't talk about different versions and the book of the book and so on. So this is one way of solving it, and this is how it's solved. And this is the solution that falls through to all the different exercises that you have access to. And as I said, you also have the answers to them, but it's this version. Remember that it's this version and how it's made. And then we go on and do the same for events, agents, and rights. So you get the information on the first page, what you know about it, and then you have some extra information, and you have some assume things that read them thoroughly, and then you read them once more to really see what it's saying, because then you can actually start filling out the agent identifier value and the type. And all these stars means that it's a vocabulary that should be used, and that's on the last page of the sheeting sheets. So you don't have to be online to do this. And same for events. You have some information, and you need to go back and look at the other pages you have already filled in to be able to fill the next one. And the same for the rights. I would say this is simple, but no, it's not. It will take a while to do it and to look at it. And you also have, as I said, all the answers. Then we have the environments. Here we do the same thing. But here we have to do and look into, remember what Elle was talking about when she talked about the environments and how these different, you have the license, you have the open source code, and how everything is connected. So now you need to have the same discussion. IT might be a little more sparky here and really don't want you to listen and say something, but do the same thing here. And upon that, you also can fill in the environment table. So before we go into the questions in parking, I think you, Eld, had an example to be able to talk us through. So I'm handing over the screen to you.
Yes. And the thing is that some of your questions reminded of a paper I did for IPRES in 2019 with an example that actually exemplifies some of your questions. And there you can also find examples of that. And also to show a bit more about different uses of the way that you combine PREMIS and METS. This is a paper. It's just IFLA's preservation of metadata, not metadata preservation. It's actually about preserving the metadata, also the preservation metadata. So, and there we had made a structure, and that's why I think this is a good example. The metadata structure, I will show you that first. Karin showed you where you just put all of it into the digital provenance. We don't do that. We do have the technical information. We take the object part in there and then have all the technical information. This is just to show you that you can do it differently. And then we have agents and events and the policy part of the object in the provenance metadata. We do not have use the PREMIS rights. Again, you can use some of it and you can leave out some of it. It can still be PREMIS conformant. Another thing we do differently than others is that we do not model the intellectual entity, but we have an ID, so we point to something abstract. Because if you describe the intellectual entity, then you can edit in it, and what is the intellectual entity then, especially when you do bit preservation of your preservation metadata. Again, different choices according to who you are. What there is in this paper is that there is a postcard example, and that's similar to a book. You have page 1, which is a front page, and page 2, which is a back page. And this is to illustrate how things can change and where you can add things. So it starts by having a you can actually find this on IDKBDK, which is lit like this. The front page can go into English, and we are down in the postcard example, but the example itself is in Danish. So taking this, you have your front page, which is a file, and you have some metadata, a representation of your file, and then you have the front page, and then you have the intellectual entity of your front page. Forget about the postcard in a minute. Then there was if there's changes in the metadata here, then you have a new representation. It's just the same file, but it's a new representation with different PREMIS metadata. Then you can change. You had the example, you redigitize a page. Here we can see it was not done properly. So we take another one in, and then we have the file in METS, and then we have a new representation of the file. So we have 3, one where it's the same file for the 2 representations, and when it's a new page, we have a totally new metadata for the file, of course, because it's changed. But they all have the same intellectual, or the digital intellectual entity. And the last one is just an example where you add the back page, because you find out that's interesting as well. It's not just a book with 1 page. In order to see this, there's actually, you can go to here where it's all, here you can see the examples. This is packed in walk, but if you look away from the walk, you actually have the XML that we put in for these cases. So that was just to show you these examples, but there are also plenty of examples on the PREMIS website, so please look there also. I just thought that this was pointing out that you can put premise into different ways, and it will also give an example of one example of what you can do if you re-digitize a page. So that was actually what I wanted to say. And I can't. There it is. Yes.
Thank you, Eld. So I'm hijacking the screen again. Do we have any questions in parking?
Not from what I can see. Let's see.
Neither me.
Anyone who has a new question?
I observe a shared file and question and answers module in Teams, and I can't see anything. I have a lot of questions, but I have to read some and recollect details. I suppose it's a huge material. It's a huge amount of knowledge in short time. It's good that it is recorded, I suppose. I think to myself privately.
I totally understand you. I know it's intense. It's a lot of things to having to figure out at once. And no, you don't need to figure it out at once. Take it piece by piece. Yeah.
Although I've read a bit about it earlier and many months ago also. However, it's difficult. It's complicated. Let's say you have to, as you underlined. There's plenty of things that should sit and think and look at it from different perspectives. So that to model it in your head before any decision. And before going into next chapter, let's say.
Exactly. And at the same time, you have, depending on which tool you have chosen as being your preservation system, it might already have incorporated premise. But still, yeah. I would say you need to know about premise to understand what your system is doing.
So even if you don't exactly implement it, just to understand it.
Yeah, to understand it. What is it for? Because that might be you. And I'm not an expert in all these different systems that exist. I know Eld has her experience, and I know Micky has experience of other softwares. But you do always have something. Look at these files. I'm going to be nasty towards Eld here. TIFF will not be the format in 10 years. It actually just vanishes. And we need to migrate all these TIFF files to something else.
Oh, we thought that JPEG 2000 will be, but it is not so soon. Still, there's some let's say, not obstacles, some problems to solve with JPEG 2000. One is the cost of the really working software, and second is the abundance of the configuration schemes and so on.
Exactly. So how do you handle that? So you need to actually have that in mind when you look at the ready system. Okay, I need to migrate all these files to something new. What does the system do? Does it actually record this migration? How am I going to be able to, in 25 years, or my grandchildren being able to say, this object is actually the same object it was in 2021 on the 18th of March at 1 p.m. 43.
Yeah. There appears one question in Teams, if you like to look at it. Yeah, by Mr. Daniel Aaron Salverovich.
Can I just add something?
Of course.
Because actually I was in Germany some years ago, where there was a Micky in the audience. and Micky had a very good comment saying we should actually regard PREMIS as a reference model.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a checklist. What are your needs for preservations? What do you, and it can look complex, yes, but it has to be, if everybody with different requirements, with different needs for preservations are to use this, it has to have options to use it differently because we have different needs. But if you think of it as a reference model, like what do we need for our preservation? What do we pick out from all this experience? Then it doesn't need to be as complex, if you understand what I mean.
Exactly.
So I think I will read Daniel's question. So in case there's some people attending who can't read this. It says, as we have seen, there are many different views as to what is a file, what is an IE, etc. How then can we ensure that we can exchange PREMIS metadata from one system to another and not end up with a mess or loss of data? I think that's actually the beauty of PREMIS. It was clear how the object category can be broken down into different levels: representation, file, intellectual entity. And there's some semantic units that only apply to specific levels, to files, but a lot of the semantic units are the same. So it's really easy to identify, I think, where an overlap is, especially using persistent identifiers or checksums. If you compare that to a different repository, they can check if they have the same file or not based on that. And I think in the end, a file is a file, and there's specific things that you can only describe at that layer. And the data model is very clear on what that is and how that should be formed.
There's also another question. Well, if not TIFF, then what?
If we could tell that now, we will be millionaires.
But it's not up to PREMIS actually.
Yeah,
That's a different. It's a different question. PREMIS can certainly describe both TIFF and whatever you choose. But yes, it is a question that we struggle with in general in digital preservation.
I would say, except neither that, but of course JPEG 2000 is a promising candidate, but I don't know if there is any other emerging.
I mean, I have my own views of JPEG 2000, but in general, I think that this question will arise for any file format because we're thinking about the long term. So it doesn't matter at all what file format we're talking about. We cannot guarantee that 20 years ago we won't be asking the same questions because there will be completely different ways to use data to render it. We might not need screens anymore because we have holograms to view them. Who knows? We just need to make sure that we have stable file formats that in the future we can use to generate new representations and capture the metadata describing what was contained in them to then ensure that, you know, we keep that alive, what we're supposed to keep alive, in a form that's then accessible.
Exactly.
Kind of the beauty of preservation.
It's also job security.
Yep.
Yeah,
you're not supposed to say that, Micky.
Oh.
Somebody talking about the matters connected with preservation of the natural environment said that there is an old saying from the South Africa that we didn't heritage the world from our ancestors. Instead, we borrowed it from our children. So that, of course, works even if digital preservation world.
With a little twist, we need to make sure that what we are borrowing from them is possible to be understandable for them. So I have actually just this almost final slide. PREMIS is a community standard. We need to make the evolution go on together. We need your examples. We need your questions. You have given us really good questions today, and we are going to take care of them and make sure that we if needed, updated the data dictionary, or where it's possible to do updates with the help of the feedback. Suggestions of things we need to do, most welcome, and most important, take part. Being in one event like this gives you understanding of PREMIS, which means you can help being ambassadors for using PREMIS for digital preservation and the metadata that we need moving forward, and handing some things back to our children or grandchildren. Was it grandchildren? So with that, we are here in our presentation. It's been a rather intense day, I think, for everybody, including Micky and me, talking about it. And as you hear, we are having different views on things, which is the beauty of this. We can actually do it as we need. So many thanks for having us. And
we really deeply appreciate that you found time to share this enormous knowledge with us. And those comments were not over. It's impossible to overestimate it. They were precious. As I said, I'm very happy that it was recorded so that I can look at it over and over. I'm very happy that you found time and that each of you brought different point of view to this, and different aspects were underlined. For me, this was a precious experience, and I'm glad that we could share it with 20 at least participants, which was the minimum of number of simultaneous attendance, and 20 up to 26 attendance top. That was very good. And again, thank you very much. I'm deeply thankful to Karin Bredenberg, to Zierau, and to Michelle Lindlar for devoting this time for this marvelous discussion and presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Have a good time. Goodbye. Goodbye, everybody.
Goodbye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye.